"And I," said little Jack, "will I not be able to help my friend Dick a little?" "Yes, dear child," replied Mrs. Weldon, clasping Jack in her arms. "You shall learn to steer, and I am sure that while you are at the helm we shall have good winds." "Very sure, very sure. Mother, I promise it to you," replied the little boy, clapping his hands. "Yes," said the young novice, smiling, "good cabin boys know how to maintain good winds. That is well known by old sailors." Then, addressing Tom and the other blacks, "My friends," he said to them, "we are going to put the Pilgrim under full sail. You will only have to do what I shall tell you." "At your orders," replied Tom. "At your orders, Captain Sand." Chapter 10. The 4 days which follow. Dick Sand was then captain of the Pilgrim, and, without losing an instant, he took the necessary measures for putting the ship under full sail. It was well understood that the passengers could have only one hope, that of reaching some part of the American coast, if not Valparaiso. What Dick Sand counted on doing was to ascertain the direction and speed of the Pilgrim, so as to get an average. For that, it was sufficient to make each day on the chart the way made, as it has been said, by the log and the compass. There was then on board one of those patent logs, with an index and helix, which give the speed very exactly for a fixed time. This useful instrument, very easily handled, could render the most useful services, and the blacks were perfectly adapted to work it. A single cause of error would interfere: the currents. To combat it, reckoning would be insufficient. Astronomical observations alone would enable one to render an exact calculation from it. Now, those observations the young novice was still unable to make. For an instant Dick Sand had thought of bringing the Pilgrim back to New Zealand. The passage would be shorter, and he would certainly have done it if the wind, which, till then, had been contrary, had not become favorable. Better worth while then to steer for America. In fact, the wind had changed almost to the contrary direction, and now it blew from the northwest with a tendency to freshen. It was then necessary to profit by it and make all the headway possible. So Dick Sand prepared to put the Pilgrim under full sail. In a schooner brig-rigged, the foremast carries 4 square sails, the foresail on the lower mast, above the topsail on the topmast, then on the topgallant mast a topsail and a royal. The mainmast, on the contrary, has fewer sails. It only carries a brigantine below and a forestafsail above. Between these two masts, on the stays which support them at the prow, a triple row of triangular sails may be set. Finally, at the prow, on the bowsprit, and its extreme end, were hauled the 3 jibs. The jibs, the brigantine, the forestaff, and the staysails are easily managed. They can be hoisted from the deck without the necessity of climbing the masts, because they are not fastened on the yards by means of rope bands, which must be previously loosened. On the contrary, the working of the foremast sails demands much greater proficiency in seamanship. In fact, when it is necessary to set them, the sailors must climb by the rigging. It may be in the foretop, it may be on the spars of the topgallant mast, it may be to the top of the said mast, and that, as well in letting them fly as in drawing them in to diminish their surface in reefing them. Thence the necessity of running out on foot ropes, movable ropes stretched below the yards, of working with one hand while holding on by the other, perilous work for anyone who is not used to it. The oscillation from the rolling and pitching of the ship, very much increased by the length of the lever, the flapping of the sails under a stiff breeze, have often sent a man overboard. It was then a truly dangerous operation for Tom and his companions. Very fortunately, the wind was moderate. The sea had not yet had time to become rough, the rolling and pitching kept within bounds. When Dick Sand, at Captain Hull's signal, had steered toward the scene of the catastrophe, the Pilgrim only carried her jibs, her brigantine, her foresail, and her topsail. To get the ship under way as quickly as possible, the novice had only to make use of, that is, to counterbrace, the foresail. The blacks had easily helped him in that maneuver. The question now was to get under full sail, and, to complete the sails, to hoist the topsails, the royal, the forestaff, and the staysails. "My friends," said the novice to the 5 blacks, "do as I tell you, and all will go right." Dick Sand was standing at the wheel of the helm. "Go," cried he. "Tom, let go that rope quickly." "Let go," said Tom, who did not understand that expression. "Yes, loosen it, now you bat, the same thing, good, heave haul taut." "Let us see, pull it in." "Like that," said Bat. "Yes, like that, very good, come Hercules strong, a good pull there." To say strong to Hercules was, perhaps, imprudent. The giant, of course, gave a pull that brought down the rope. "Oh, not so strong, my honest fellow," cried Dick Sand, smiling. "You are going to bring down the masts." "I have hardly pulled," replied Hercules. "Well, only make believe. You will see that that will be enough. Well, slacken, cast off, make fast like that. Good all together, heave, pull on the braces." And the whole breadth of the foremast, whose larboard braces had been loosened, turned slowly. The wind, then swelling the sails, imparted a certain speed to the ship. Dick Sand then had the jib sheet ropes loosened. Then he called the blacks aft. "Behold what is done, my friends, and well done. Now let us attend to the mainmast, but break nothing, Hercules." "I shall try," replied the Colossus, without being willing to promise more. This second operation was quite easy. The main boom sheet rope having been let go gently, the brigantine took the wind more regularly, and added its powerful action to that of the forward sails. The forestaff was then set above the brigantine, and, as it is simply brailed up, there was nothing to do but bear on the rope, to haul aboard, then to secure it. But Hercules pulled so hard, along with his friend Actaeon, without counting little Jack, who had joined them, that the rope broke off. All three fell backwards, happily without hurting themselves. Jack was enchanted. That's nothing," cried the novice. "Fasten the two ends together for this time and hoist softly." That was done under Dick Sand's eyes, while he had not yet left the helm. The Pilgrim was already sailing rapidly, headed to the east, and there was nothing more to be done but keep it in that direction. Nothing easier because the wind was favorable and lurches were not to be feared. "Good, my friends," said the novice. "You will be good sailors before the end of the voyage." "We shall do our best, Captain Sand," replied Tom. Mrs. Weldon also complimented those honest men. Little Jack himself received his share of praise, for he had worked bravely. "Indeed, I believe, Mr. Jack," said Hercules, smiling, "that it was you who broke the rope. What a good little fist you have. Without you we should have done nothing right." And little Jack, very proud of himself, shook his friend Hercules' hand vigorously. The setting of the Pilgrim's sails was not yet complete. She still lacked those topsails whose action is not to be despised under this full sail movement. Topsail, royal, staysails would add sensibly to the schooner's speed, and Dick Sand resolved to set them. This operation would be more difficult than the others, not for the staysails, which could be hoisted, hauled aboard and fastened from below, but for the crossjacks of the foremast. It was necessary to climb to the spars to let them out, and Dick Sand, not wishing to expose any one of his improvised crew, undertook to do it himself. He then called Tom and put him at the wheel, showing him how he should keep the ship. Then Hercules, Bat, Actaeon, and Austin being placed, some at the royal halyards, others at those of the topsails, he proceeded up the mast. To climb the rattlings of the foreshrouds, then the rattlings of the topmast shrouds, to gain the spars, that was only play for the young novice. In a minute he was on the foot rope of the topsail yard, and he let go the rope bands which kept the sail bound. Then he stood on the spars again and climbed on the royal yard, where he let out the sail rapidly. Dick Sand had finished his task, and seizing one of the starboard backstays, he slid to the deck. There, under his directions, the two sails were vigorously hauled and fastened, then the 2 yards hoisted to the block. The staysails being set next between the mainmast and the foremast, the work was finished. Hercules had broken nothing this time. The Pilgrim then carried all the sails that composed her rigging. Doubtless Dick Sand could still add the foremast studding sails to larboard, but it was difficult work under the present circumstances, and should it be necessary to take them in case of a squall, it could not be done fast enough. So the novice stopped there. Tom was relieved from his post at the wheel, which Dick Sand took charge of again. The breeze freshened. The Pilgrim, making a slight turn to starboard, glided rapidly over the surface of the sea, leaving behind her a very flat track, which bore witness to the purity of her waterline. "We are well under way, Mrs. Weldon," then said Dick Sand, "and now may God preserve this favorable wind." Mrs. Weldon pressed the young man's hand. Then, fatigued with all the emotions of that last hour, she sought her cabin and fell into a sort of painful drowsiness, which was not sleep. The new crew remained on the schooner's deck, watching on the forecastle, and ready to obey Dick Sand's orders. That is to say, to change the set of the sails according to the variations of the wind. But so long as the breeze kept both that force and that direction, there would be positively nothing to do. During all this time, what had become of Cousin Benedict? Cousin Benedict was occupied in studying with a magnifying glass an articulate which he had at last found on board, a simple orthopter, whose head disappeared under the prothorax, an insect with flat elytrums, with round abdomen, with rather long wings, which belonged to the family of the roaches, and to the species of American cockroaches. It was exactly while ferreting in Negoro's kitchen that he had made that precious discovery, and at the moment when the cook was going to crush the said insect pitilessly. Thence anger, which, indeed, Negoro took no notice of. But this cousin Benedict, did he know what change had taken place on board since the moment when Captain Hull and his companions had commenced that fatal whale fishing? Yes, certainly. He was even on the deck when the Pilgrim arrived in sight of the remains of the whaleboat. The schooner's crew had then perished before his eyes. To pretend that this catastrophe had not affected him would be to accuse his heart. That pity for others that all people feel, he had certainly experienced it. He was equally moved by his cousin's situation. He had come to press Mrs. Weldon's hand as if to say to her, "Do not be afraid, I am here, I am left to you." Then Cousin Benedict had turned toward his cabin, doubtless so as to reflect on the consequences of this disastrous event and on the energetic measures that he must take. But on his way he had met the cockroach in question, and his desire was held, however, against certain entomologists, to prove the cockroaches of the forest species, remarkable for their colors, have very different habits from cockroaches properly so called. He had given himself up to the study, forgetting both that there had been a Captain Hull in command of the Pilgrim, and that that unfortunate had just perished with his crew. The cockroach absorbed him entirely. He did not admire it less, and he made as much time over it as if that horrible insect had been a golden beetle. The life on board had then returned to its usual course, though everyone would remain for a long time, yet under the effects of such a keen and unforeseen catastrophe. During this day Dick Sand was everywhere, so that everything should be in its place, and that he could be prepared for the smallest contingency. The blacks obeyed him with zeal. The most perfect order reigned on board the Pilgrim. It might then be hoped that all would go well. On his side, Negoro made no other attempt to resist Dick Sand's authority. He appeared to have tacitly recognized him. Occupied as usual in his narrow kitchen, he was not seen more than before. Besides, at the least infraction, at the first symptom of insubordination, Dick Sand was determined to send him to the hold for the rest of the passage. At a sign from him, Hercules would take the head cook by the skin of the neck. That would not have taken long. In that case, Nan, who knew how to cook, would replace the cook in his functions. Negoro then could say to himself that he was indispensable, and, as he was closely watched, he seemed unwilling to give any cause of complaint. The wind, though growing stronger till evening, did not necessitate any change in the Pilgrim's sails. Her solid masting, her iron rigging, which was in good condition, would enable her to bear in this condition even a stronger breeze. During the night it is often the custom to lessen the sails, and particularly to take in the high sails, forestaff, topsail, royal, etc. That is prudent, in case some squall of wind should come up suddenly. But Dick Sand believed he could dispense with this precaution. The state of the atmosphere indicated nothing of the kind, and besides, the young novice determined to pass the first night on the deck, intending to have an eye to everything. Then the progress was more rapid, and he longed to be in less desolate parts. It has been said that the log and the compass were the only instruments which Dick Sand could use, so as to estimate approximately the way made by the Pilgrim. During this day, the novice threw the log every half hour, and he noted the indications furnished by the instrument. As to the instrument which bears the name of compass, there were two on board. One was placed in the binnacle, under the eyes of the man at the helm. Its dial, lighted by day by the diurnal light, by night by two side lamps, indicated at every moment which way the ship headed, that is, the direction she followed. The other compass was an inverted one, fixed to the bars of the cabin which Captain Hull formerly occupied. By that means, without leaving his chamber, he could always know if the route given was exactly followed, if the man at the helm, from ignorance or negligence, allowed the ship to make too great lurches. Besides, there is no ship employed in long voyages which does not possess at least two compasses, as she has two chronometers. It is necessary to compare these instruments with each other, and, consequently, control their indications. The Pilgrim was then sufficiently provided for in that respect, and Dick Sand charged his men to take the greatest care of the two compasses, which were so necessary to him. Now, unfortunately, during the night of the 12th to the 13th of February, while the novice was on watch and holding the wheel of the helm, a sad accident took place. The inverted compass, which was fastened by a copper ferrule to the woodwork of the cabin, broke off and fell on the floor. It was not seen till the next day. How had the ferrule come to break? It was inexplicable enough. It was possible, however, that it was oxidized and that the pitching and rolling had broken it from the woodwork. Now, indeed, the sea had been rougher during the night. However it was, the compass was broken in such a manner that it could not be repaired. Dick Sand was much thwarted. Henceforth, he was reduced to trust solely to the compass in the binnacle. Very evidently, no one was responsible for the breaking of the second compass, but it might have sad consequences. The novice then took every precaution to keep the other compass beyond the reach of every accident. Till then, with that exception, all went well on board the Pilgrim. Mrs. Weldon, seeing Dick Sand's calmness, had regained confidence. It was not that she had ever yielded to despair. Above all, she counted on the goodness of God. Also, as a sincere and pious Catholic, she comforted herself by prayer. Dick Sand had arranged so as to remain at the helm during the night. He slept 5 or 6 hours in the day, and that seemed enough for him, as he did not feel too much fatigued. During this time, Tom or his son Bat took his place at the wheel of the helm, and, thanks to his counsels, they were gradually becoming passable steersmen. Often Mrs. Weldon and the novice talked to each other. Dick Sand willingly took advice from this intelligent and courageous woman. Each day he showed her on the ship's chart the course run, which he took by reckoning, taking into account only the direction and the speed of the ship. "See, Mrs. Weldon," he often repeated to her, "with these winds blowing, we cannot fail to reach the coast of South America. I should not like to affirm it, but I verily believe that when our vessel shall arrive in sight of land, it will not be far from Valparaiso." Mrs. Weldon could not doubt the direction of the vessel was right, favored above all by those winds from the northwest. But how far the Pilgrim still seemed to be from the American coast. How many dangers between her and the firm land, only counting those which might come from a change in the state of the sea and the sky. Jack, indifferent like children of his age, had returned to his usual games, running on the deck, amusing himself with Dingo. He found, of course, that his friend Dick was less with him than formerly, but his mother had made him understand that they must leave the young novice entirely to his occupations. Little Jack had given up to these reasons, and no longer disturbed Captain Sand. So past life on board, the blacks did their work intelligently, and each day became more skillful in the sailor's craft. Tom was naturally the boatswain, and it was he, indeed, whom his companions would have chosen for that office. He commanded the watch while the novice rested, and he had with him his son Bat and Austin. Actaeon and Hercules formed the other watch under Dick Sand's direction. By this means, while one steered, the others watched at the prow. Even though these parts were deserted and no collision was really to be feared, the novice exacted a rigorous watch during the night. He never sailed without having his lights in position, a green light on the starboard, a red light on the larboard, and in that he acted wisely. All the time, during those nights which Dick Sand passed entirely at the helm, he occasionally felt an irresistible heaviness over him. His hand then steered by pure instinct. It was the effect of a fatigue of which he did not wish to take account. Now, it happened that during the night of the 13th to the 14th of February, that Dick Sand was very tired and was obliged to take a few hours' rest. He was replaced at the helm by old Tom. The sky was covered with thick clouds, which had gathered with the evening, under the influence of the cold air. It was then very dark, and it was impossible to distinguish the high sails lost in the darkness. Hercules and Actaeon were on watch on the forecastle. Aft, the light from the binnacle only gave a faint gleam, which the metallic apparatus of the wheel reflected softly. The ship's lanterns, throwing their lights laterally, left the deck of the vessel in profound darkness. Toward 3 o'clock in the morning, a kind of hypnotic phenomenon took place, of which old Tom was not even conscious. His eaves, which were fixed too long on a luminous point of the binnacle, suddenly lost the power of vision, and he fell into a true and aesthetic sleep. Not only was he incapable of seeing, but if one had touched or pinched him hard, he would probably have felt nothing. So he did not see a shadow which glided over the deck. It was Negoro. Arrived aft, the head cook placed under the binnacle a pretty heavy object which he held in hand. Then, after observing for an instant the luminous index of the compass, he retired without having been seen. If, the next day, Dick Sand had perceived that object placed by Negoro under the binnacle, he might have hastened to take it away. In fact, it was a piece of iron, whose influence had just altered the indications of the compass. The magnetic needle had been deviated, and instead of marking the magnetic north, which differs a little from the north of the world, it marked the northeast. It was then a deviation of 4 points, in other words, of half a right angle. Tom soon recovered from his drowsiness. His eyes were fixed on the compass. He had reason to believe, that the Pilgrim was not in the right direction. He then moved the helm so as to head the ship to the east, at least he thought so. But with the deviation of the needle, which he could not suspect, that point, changed by 4 points, was the southeast. And thus, while under the action of a favorable wind, the Pilgrim was supposed to follow the direction wished for, she sailed with an error of 45 degrees in her route. Chapter 11. Tempest. During the week which followed that event, from the 14th of February to the 21st, no incident took place on board. The wind from the northwest freshened gradually, and the Pilgrim sailed rapidly, making on an average 160 miles in 24 hours. It was nearly all that could be asked of a vessel of that size. Dick Sand thought the schooner must be approaching those parts more frequented by the merchant vessels which seek to pass from one hemisphere to the other. The novice was always hoping to encounter one of those ships, and he clearly intended either to transfer his passengers or to borrow some additional sailors and perhaps an officer. But though he watched vigilantly, no ship could be signaled, and the sea was always deserted. Dick Sand continued to be somewhat astonished at that. He had crossed this part of the Pacific several times during his 3 fishing voyages to the southern seas. Now, in the latitude and longitude where his reckoning put him, it was seldom that some English or American ship did not appear, ascending from Cape Horn toward the equator, or coming toward the extreme point of South America. But what Dick Sand was ignorant of, what he could not even discover, was that the Pilgrim was already in higher latitude, that is to say, more to the south than he supposed. That was so for 2 reasons. The first was that the currents of these parts, whose swiftness the novice could only imperfectly estimate, had contributed, while he could not possibly keep account of them, to throw the ship out of her route. The second was that the compass, made inaccurate by Negoro's guilty hand, henceforth only gave incorrect bearings. Bearings that, since the loss of the second compass, Dick Sand could not control, so that believing and having reason to believe that he was sailing eastward, in reality, he was sailing southeast. The compass, it was always before his eyes. The log, it was thrown regularly. His 2 instruments permitted him, in a certain measure, to direct the Pilgrim and to estimate the number of miles sailed. But then, was that sufficient? However, the novice always did his best to reassure Mrs. Weldon, whom the incidents of this voyage must at times render anxious. We shall arrive, he repeated. We shall reach the American coast here or there. It matters little on the whole, but we cannot fail to land there. I do not doubt it, Dick. Of course, Mrs. Weldon, I should be more at ease if you were not on board, if we had only ourselves to answer for, But if I were not on board, replied Mrs. Weldon, if Cousin Benedict, Jack, Nan, and I had not taken passage on the Pilgrim, and if, on the other hand, Tom and his companions had not been picked up at sea, Dick, there would be only 2 men here, you and Negoro. What would have become of you, alone with that wicked man, in whom you cannot have confidence? Yes, my child, what would have become of you? I should have begun, replied Dick Sand resolutely, by putting Negoro where he could not injure me. And you would have worked alone. Yes, alone with the aid of God. The firmness of these words was well calculated to encourage Mrs. Weldon. But nevertheless, while thinking of her little Jack, she often felt uneasy. If the woman would not show what she experienced as a mother, she did not always succeed in preventing some secret anguish for him to rend her heart. Meanwhile, if the young novice was not sufficiently advanced in his hydrographic studies to make his point, he possessed a true sailor's scent when the question was to tell the weather. The appearance of the sky, for one thing, on the other hand, the indications of the barometer, enabled him to be on his guard. Captain Hull, a good meteorologist, had taught him to consult this instrument, whose prognostications are remarkably sure. Here is, in a few words, what the notices relative to the observation of the barometer contain. Such are the general consequences to draw from the indications of this precious instrument. Dick Sand knew all that perfectly well, as he had ascertained for himself in different circumstances of his sailor's life, which made him very skillful in putting himself on his guard against all contingencies. Now, just toward the 20th of February, the oscillations of the barometrical column began to preoccupy the young novice, who noted them several times a day with much care. In fact, the barometer began to fall in a slow and continuous manner, which presages rain. But this rain being delayed, Dick Sand concluded from that the bad weather would last. That is what must happen. But the rain was the wind, and in fact, at that date, the breeze freshened so much that the air was displaced with a velocity of 60 feet a second, say 31 miles an hour. Dick Sand was obliged to take some precautions so as not to risk the Pilgrim's masting and sails. Already he had the royal, the forestaff, and the flying jib taken in, and he resolved to do the same with the topsail, then take in 2 reefs in the topsail. This last operation must present certain difficulties with a crew of little experience. Hesitation would not do, however, and no one hesitated. Dick Sand, accompanied by Bat and Austin, climbed into the rigging of the foremast and succeeded, not without trouble, in taking in the topsail. In less threatening weather he would have left the 2 yards on the mast, but, foreseeing that he would probably be obliged to level that mast, and perhaps even to lay it down upon the deck, he unrigged the 2 yards and sent them to the deck. In fact, it is understood that when the wind becomes too strong, not only must the sails be diminished, but also the masting. That is a great relief to the ship, which, carrying less weight above, is no longer so much strained with the rolling and pitching. This first work accomplished, and it took 2 hours, Dick Sand and his companions were busy reducing the surface of the topsail by taking in 2 reefs. The Pilgrim did not carry, like the majority of modern ships, a double topsail, which facilitates the operation. It was necessary then to work as formerly. That is to say, to run out on the foot ropes, pull toward you a sail beaten by the wind, and lash it firmly with its reef lines. It was difficult, long, perilous. But finally the diminished topsail gave less surface to the wind, and the schooner was much relieved. Dick Sand came down again with Bat and Austin. The Pilgrim was then in the sailing condition demanded by that state of the atmosphere which has been qualified as very stiff. During the 3 days which followed, 20th, 21st, and of February, the force and direction of the wind were not perceptibly changed. All the time the mercury continued to fall in the barometrical tube, and on this last day, the novice noted that it kept continually below 28 and 7/10 inches. Besides, there was no appearance that the barometer would rise for some time. The aspect of the sky was bad and extremely windy. Besides, thick fogs covered it constantly. Their stratum was even so deep that the sun was no longer seen, and it would have been difficult to indicate precisely the place of his setting and rising. Dick Sand began to be anxious. He no longer left the deck, he hardly slept. However, his moral energy enabled him to drive back his fears to the bottom of his heart. The next day, February 22d, the breeze appeared to decrease a little in the morning, but Dick Sand did not trust in it. He was right, for in the afternoon the wind freshened again, and the sea became rougher. Toward 4 o'clock, Negoro, who was rarely seen, left his post and came up on the forecastle. Dingo, doubtless, was sleeping in some corner, for it did not bark as usual. Negoro, always silent, remained for half an hour observing the horizon. Long surges succeeded each other without, as yet, being dashed together. However, they were higher than the force of the wind accounted for. One must conclude from that there was very bad weather in the west, perhaps at a rather short distance, and that it would not be long in reaching these parts. Negoro watched that vast extent of sea, which was greatly troubled around the Pilgrim. Then his eyes, always cold and dry, turned toward the sky. The aspect of the sky was disturbing. The vapors moved with very different velocities. The clouds of the upper zone traveled more rapidly than those of the low strata of the atmosphere. The case then must be foreseen, in which those heavy masses would fall, and might change into a tempest, perhaps a hurricane, what was yet only a very stiff breeze. That is to say, a displacement of the air at the rate of 43 miles an hour. Whether Negoro was not a man to be frightened, or whether he understood nothing of the threats of the weather, he did not appear to be affected. However, an evil smile glided over his lips. One would say, at the end of his observations, that this state of things was rather calculated to please him than to displease him. One moment he mounted on the bowsprit and crawled as far as the ropes, so as to extend his range of vision, as if he were seeking some indication on the horizon. Then he descended again, and tranquilly, without having pronounced a single word, without having made a gesture, he regained the crew's quarters. Meanwhile, in the midst of all these fearful conjunctions, there remained one happy circumstance which each one on board ought to remember. It was that this wind, violent as it was or might become, was favorable, and that the Pilgrim seemed to be rapidly making the American coast. If, indeed, the weather did not turn to tempest, this navigation would continue to be accomplished without great danger, and the veritable perils would only spring up when the question would be to land on some badly ascertained point of the coast. That was indeed what Dick Sand was already asking himself. When he should once make the land, how should he act if he did not encounter some pilot, someone who knew the coast? In case the bad weather should oblige him to seek a port of refuge, what should he do because that coast was to him absolutely unknown? Indeed, he had not yet to trouble himself with that contingency. However, when the hour should come, he would be obliged to adopt some plan. Well, Dick Sand adopted one. During the 13 days which elapsed, from the 24th of February to the 9th of March, the state of the atmosphere did not change in any perceptible manner. The sky was always loaded with heavy fogs. For a few hours the wind went down, then it began to blow again with the same force. 2 or 3 times the barometer rose again, but its oscillation, comprising a dozen lines, was too sudden to announce a change of weather and a return of more manageable winds. Besides, the barometrical column fell again almost immediately, and nothing could inspire any hope of the end of that bad weather within a short period. Terrible storms burst forth also, which very seriously disturbed Dick Sand. 2 or 3 times the lightning struck the waves only a few cable lengths from the ship. Then the rain fell in torrents and made those whirlpools of half-condensed vapors, which surrounded the Pilgrim with a thick mist. For entire hours the man at the lookout saw nothing, and the ship sailed at random. Even though the ship, although resting firmly on the waves, was horribly shaken, Mrs. Weldon, fortunately, supported this rolling and pitching without being incommoded. But her little boy was very much tried, and she was obliged to give him all her care. As to Cousin Benedict, he was no more sick than the American cockroaches which he made his society, and he passed his time in studying, as if he were quietly settled in his study in San Francisco. Very fortunately, also, Tom and his companions found themselves little sensitive to seasickness, and they could continue to come to the young novice's aid, well accustomed, himself, to all those excessive movements of a ship which flies before the weather. The Pilgrim ran rapidly under this reduced sail, and already Dick Sand foresaw that he would be obliged to reduce it again, but he wished to hold out as long as it would be possible to do so without danger. According to his reckoning, the coast ought to be no longer distant, so they watched with care. All the time the novice could hardly trust his companions' eyes to discover the first indications of land. In fact, no matter what good sight he may have, he who is not accustomed to interrogating the sea horizons is not skillful in distinguishing the first contours of a coast, above all in the middle of fogs. So Dick Sand must watch himself, and he often climbed as far as the spars to see better, but no sign yet of the American coast. This astonished him, and Mrs. Weldon, by some words which escaped him, understood that astonishment. It was the 9th of March. The novice kept at the prow, sometimes observing the sea and the sky, sometimes looking at the Pilgrim's masting, which began to strain under the force of the wind. "You see nothing yet, Dick?" she asked him, at a moment when he had just left the long lookout. "Nothing, Mrs. Weldon, nothing," replied the novice. "And meanwhile the horizon seems to clear a little under this violent wind, which is going to blow still harder. And according to you, Dick, the American coast ought not to be distant now." "It cannot be, Mrs. Weldon, and if anything astonishes me, it is not having made it yet." "Meanwhile," continued Mrs. Weldon, "the ship has always followed the right course." "Always since the wind settled in the northwest," replied Dick Sand. "That is to say, since the day when we lost our unfortunate captain and his crew. That was the 10th of February. We are now on the 9th of March. There have been then 27 since that." "But at that period what distance were we from the coast?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "About 4,500 miles, Mrs. Weldon. If there are things about which I have more than a doubt, I can at least guarantee this figure within about 20 miles. And what has been the ship's speed? On an average, 180 miles a day since the wind freshened, replied the novice. So, I am surprised at not being in sight of land. And, what is still more extraordinary is that we do not meet even a single one of those vessels which generally frequent these parts. Could you not be deceived, Dick? Returned Mrs. Weldon, in estimating the Pilgrim's speed. No, Mrs. Weldon. On that point I could not be mistaken. The log has been thrown every half hour, and I have taken its indications very accurately. Wait, I am going to have it thrown anew, and you will see that we are sailing at this moment at the rate of 10 miles an hour, which would give us more than 200 miles a day. Dick Sand called Tom and gave him the order to throw the log, an operation to which the old black was now quite accustomed. The log, firmly fastened to the end of the line, was brought and sent out. 25 fathoms were hardly unrolled when the rope suddenly slackened between Tom's hands. "Ah, Mr. Dick," cried he. "Well, Tom, the rope has broken." "Broken," cried Dick Sand, "and the log is lost." Old Tom showed the end of the rope which remained in his hand. It was only too true. It was not the fastening which had failed. The rope had broken in the middle, and nevertheless that rope was of the first quality. It must have been then that the strands of the rope at the point of rupture were singularly worn. They were, in fact, and Dick Sand could tell that when he had the end of the rope in his hands. But had they become so by use? Was what the novice, become suspicious, asked himself. However that was, the log was now lost, and Dick Sand had no longer any means of telling exactly the speed of his ship. In the way of instruments, he only possessed one compass, and he did not know that its indications were false. Mrs. Weldon saw him so saddened by this accident that she did not wish to insist, and, with a very heavy heart, she retired into her cabin. But if the Pilgrim's speed, and consequently the way sailed over, could no longer be estimated, it was easy to tell that the ship's headway was not diminishing. In fact, the next day, March 10th, the barometer fell to 28 and 2/10 inches. It was the announcement of one of those blasts of wind which travel as much as 60 miles an hour. It became urgent to change once more the state of the sails, so as not to risk the security of the vessel. Dick Sand resolved to bring down his topgallant mast and his forestaff, and to furl his low sails, so as to sail under his foretopmast staysail and the low reef of his topsail. He called Tom and his companions to help him in that difficult operation, which, unfortunately, could not be executed with rapidity. And meanwhile time pressed, for the tempest already declared itself with violence. Dick Sands, Austin, Actaeon, and Bat climbed into the masting, while Tom remained at the wheel, and Hercules on the deck so as to slacken the ropes as soon as he was commanded. After numerous efforts, the forestaff and the topgallant mast were gotten down upon the deck, not without these honest men having 100 times risked being precipitated into the sea. The rolling shook the masting to such an extent. Then, the topsail having been lessened and the foresail furled, the schooner carried only her foretopmast staysail and the low reef of the topsail. Even though her sails were then extremely reduced, the Pilgrim continued, nonetheless, to sail with excessive velocity. The 12th the weather took a still worse appearance. On that day at dawn, Dick Sand saw, not without terror, the barometer fall to 27 and 9/10 inches. It was a real tempest which was raging, and such that the Pilgrim could not carry even the little sail she had left. Dick Sand, seeing that his topsail was going to be torn, gave the order to furl. But it was in vain. A more violent gust struck the ship at that moment and tore off the sail. Austin, who was on the yard of the foretopsail, was struck by the larboard sheet rope. Wounded, but rather slightly, he could climb down again to the deck. Dick Sand, extremely anxious, had but one thought. It was that the ship, urged with such fury, was going to be dashed to pieces every moment, for, according to his calculation, the rocks of the coast could not be distant. He then returned to the prow, but he saw nothing which had the appearance of land, and then came back to the wheel. A moment after Negoro came on deck. There, suddenly, as if in spite of himself, his arm was extended toward a point of the horizon. One would say that he recognized some high land in the fogs. Still, once more he smiled wickedly, and without saying anything of what he had been able to see, he returned to his post. Chapter 12. On the horizon. At that date, the tempest took its most terrible form, that of the hurricane. The wind had set in from the southwest. The air moved with a velocity of 90 miles an hour. It was indeed a hurricane, in fact, one of those terrible windstorms which wrecks all the ships of a roadstead, and which, even on land, the most solid structures cannot resist. Such was the one which, on the 25th of July, 1825, devastated Guadeloupe. When heavy cannons, carrying balls of 24 pounds, are raised from their carriages, one may imagine what would become of a ship which has no other point of support than an unsteady sea. And meanwhile, it is to its mobility alone that she may owe her salvation. She yields to the wind, and provided she is strongly built, she is in a condition to brave the most violent surges. That was the case with the Pilgrim. A few minutes after the topsail had been torn in pieces, the foretopmast staysail was in its turn torn off. Dick Sand must then give up the idea of setting even a stormjib, a small sail of strong linen, which would make the ship easier to govern. The Pilgrim then ran without canvas, but the wind took effect on her hull, her masts, her rigging, and nothing more was needed to impart to her an excessive velocity. Sometimes even she seemed to emerge from the waves, and it was to be believed that she hardly grazed them. Under these circumstances, the rolling of the ship, tossed about on the enormous billows raised by the tempest, was frightful. There was danger of receiving some monstrous surge aft. Those mountains of water ran faster than the schooner, threatening to strike her stern if she did not rise pretty fast. That is extreme danger for every ship which scuds before the tempest. But what could be done to ward off that contingency? Greater speed could not be imparted to the Pilgrim, because she would not have kept the smallest piece of canvas. She must then be managed as much as possible by means of the helm, whose action was often powerless. Dick Sand no longer left the helm. He was lashed by the waist so as not to be carried away by some surge. Tom and Bat, fastened also, stood near to help him. Hercules and Actaeon, bound to the bitts, watched forward. As to Mrs. Weldon, to little Jack, to Cousin Benedict, to Nan, they remained, by order of the novice, in the aft cabins. Mrs. Weldon would have preferred to have remained on deck, but Dick Sand was strongly opposed to it. It would be exposing herself uselessly. All the scuttles had been hermetically nailed up. It was hoped that they would resist if some formidable billow should fall on the ship. If, by any mischance, they should yield under the weight of these avalanches, the ship might fill and sink. Very fortunately, also, the stowage had been well attended to, so that, notwithstanding the terrible tossing of the vessel, her cargo was not moved about. Dick Sand had again reduced the number of hours which he gave to sleep, so Mrs. Weldon began to fear that he would take sick. She made him consent to take some repose. Now, it was while he was still lying down, during the night of the 13th to the 14th of March, that a new incident took place. Tom and Bat were aft, when Negoro, who rarely appeared on that part of the deck, drew near, and even seemed to wish to enter into conversation with them. But Tom and his son did not reply to him. Suddenly, in a violent rolling of the ship, Negoro fell, and he would, doubtless, have been thrown into the sea if he had not held on to the binnacle. Tom gave a cry, fearing the compass would be broken. Dick Sand, in a moment of wakefulness, heard that cry, and rushing out of his quarters, he ran aft. Negoro had already risen, but he held in his hand the piece of iron which he had just taken from under the binnacle, and he hid it before Dick Sand could see it. Was it, then, Negoro's interest for the magnetic needle to return to its true direction? Yes, for these southwest winds served him now. "What's the matter?" asked the novice. "It's that cook of misfortune who has just fallen on the compass," replied Tom. At those words, Dick Sand, in the greatest anxiety, leaned over the binnacle. It was in good condition. The compass, lighted by two lamps, rested as usual on its concentric circles. The young novice was greatly affected. The breaking of the only compass on board would be an irreparable misfortune. But what Dick Sand could not observe was that, since the taking away of the piece of iron, the needle had returned to its normal position, and indicated exactly the magnetic north as it ought to be under that meridian. Meanwhile, if Negoro could not be made responsible for a fall which seemed to be involuntary, Dick Sand had reason to be astonished that he was, at that hour, aft in the ship. "What are you doing there?" he asked him. "What I please," replied Negoro. "You say," cried Dick Sand, who could not restrain his anger. "I say," replied the head cook, "that there is no rule which forbids walking aft." "Well, I make that the rule," replied Dick Sand, "and I forbid you, remember, to come aft." Indeed, replied Negoro. That man, so entirely under self-control, then made a menacing gesture. The novice drew a revolver from his pocket and pointed it at the head cook. Negoro, said he, recollect that I am never without this revolver, and that on the first act of insubordination I shall blow out your brains. At that moment, Negoro felt himself irresistibly bent to the deck. It was Hercules, who had just simply laid his heavy hand on Negoro's shoulder. Captain Sand, said the giant, do you want me to throw this rascal overboard? He will regale the fishes, who are not hard to please. Not yet, replied Dick Sand. Negoro rose as soon as the black's hand no longer weighed upon him. But, in passing Hercules, accursed Negro, murmured he, I'll pay you back. Meanwhile, the wind had just changed. At least, it seemed to have veered round 45 degrees. And, notwithstanding, a singular thing which struck the novice, nothing in the condition of the sea indicated that change. The ship headed the same way all the time, but the wind and the waves, instead of taking her directly aft, now struck her by the larboard quarter, a very dangerous situation, which exposes a ship to receive bad surges. So Dick Sand was obliged to veer round 4 points to continue to scud before the tempest. But on the other hand, his attention was awakened more than ever. He asked himself if there was not some connection between Negoro's fall and the breaking of the first compass. What did the head cook intend to do there? Had he some interest in putting the second compass out of service also? What could that interest be? There was no explanation of that. Must not Negoro desire, as they all desired, to land on the American coast as soon as possible?